mutual loyalty, and support. Spiritual leaders should be supportive of their fellow servants, especially when they become vulnerable to criticism from immature Christians. Here's Gene to explain this principle.
What is the basis of this principle? Well, let me take you to a very significant paragraph here. 1 Corinthians 16, beginning with verse 13. Paul says, as he's culminating the letter now, he says, "Be alert, stand firm in the faith, be brave and strong," and here's a key phrase, "your every action must be done with love." And one of the reasons he said that is that they were not noted for actions of love. We saw that in 1 Corinthians chapter 13 when he summarizes that they didn't have any love, because he said love is patient and you're impatient. Love is kind and you're unkind. Love is moral, you're immoral. Love is, and he goes on, he lists a whole profile of love. So they needed a message here of love, and so he says, "Brothers, you know the household of Stephanas. You know them well, right? They're the first fruits of Achaia." Now, we're not sure. See, Corinth is in Achaia. And we're not sure whether Stephanas, the household of Stephanas, was from Corinth. Many believe that he was. And so Paul was just generalizing here because he says, you know him. It may be that he was from Cenchrea. Cenchrea is just 10 miles from Corinth. That's where Phoebe came from, and she was a strong saint in the Lord, chapter 16 of Romans. But he was in the area because they knew him. They're the first fruits of Achaia and have devoted themselves to serving the saints. He says, you know what they've done. You know that they are committed to serving people. They're committed to serving you. That's the implication. Now notice what he said. I urge you also to submit to such people and to everyone who works and labors with them. In other words, Stephanas had a group of people around him that were all committed to the same thing in terms of ministry and service. That's why maybe he's not talking about people who lived right in Corinth. It was people around them. And they had a reputation that was known in Corinth. And he said, I want you to submit not just to the household of Stephanas, but I want to submit to all the people who are laboring with them to achieve spiritual goals. He said, I'm delighted over the presence of Stephanas. In other words, Stephanas is the one that brought me a report about you. Think about that for a moment. What did Stephanas report? Well, first of all, he brought a letter. And then he brought an oral report. He brought both. And they had questions that they wanted Stephanas to ask Paul. They were outlined in this letter, 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Now, along with Stephanas was a guy by the name of Fortunatus and Achaicus. And they obviously were well known in Corinth because it says these men have made up for your absence. In other words, I couldn't interface with you, but I've interfaced with them, and they have represented you. They've refreshed my spirit, and yours, by the way. Therefore, recognize such people. Now, imagine that you were Stephanas. Imagine that you were Fortunatus. Imagine that you were Achaicus. You came to Paul and you delivered this letter from them. And Paul answered those questions that you had asked. You remember those questions like marriage questions? They had questions about marriage. They had written out questions about singleness, questions about worship, order, and practices. And Paul addressed all those questions, right? Do you think in that letter they asked the question what they should do with the immorality in the church? I doubt it. Do you think they asked the question about lawsuits in that letter? I doubt it. I'm speculating. Do you think they asked about the way they were abusing the Lord's Supper, getting drunk at the Lord's Supper, overeating, being gluttonous, and all those things? I don't think so. But one thing I know so, Paul got it from these three guys. And I think what they said is, Paul, they've written out some good questions here, but let me give you a real perspective on the problems in Corinth. And what happened when Paul wrote 1 Corinthians? He addressed all of those issues. All of those issues. Now, if you're a Fortunatus and these other two men, would you be looking forward to going back to Corinth? Would you be looking forward to saying, we had a wonderful time with Paul, here's a letter that he wrote. And by the way, he addressed a few issues that you didn't raise in your letter. And you're sitting there listening to this letter being read to you, and you're one of the people that's involved in the immorality, you're one of the people that's approving it, you're one of the people that's getting drunk at the Lord's table, you're one of the people that are abusing a lot of things. What would happen to you? If you're that kind of person, now, what kind of person will you be in responding to these men? You're going to be livid. Now, the reason I bring this up, because it relates to the principle. The principle, let me read it again. To be trustworthy spiritual leaders, we must be loyal to our fellow servants, especially when they become vulnerable to criticism from immature Christians. And believe me, these men were vulnerable. And that's why, if you read this paragraph with this in mind, it takes on some significant meaning. In fact, let me take you back and just reread verses 13 to 18 again. Be alert, stand firm in the faith, be brave and strong. Your every action must be done with love. And now he's going to say something. Brothers, you know the household of Stephanas. Let your every action be done in love. Because they're going to tell you some things you're not going to hear. They're going to report some stuff that they've shared with me, and I'm going to address it. They're the first fruits of Achaia. They've devoted themselves to serving the saints. They're not in this for themselves. They have been vulnerable. They're here because they care about you. They're the ones that told us about the divisions. And some of you are following Paul, and some of you are following Peter, and some of you are following Apollos. And believe me, if they were doing that in relationship to Peter and Paul and Apollos, do you think they would do it with Stephanas and the other two gentlemen? Of course they would. They've devoted themselves to serving the saints. I urge you to submit to such people and to everyone who works and labors with them. They care about you. And I'm delighted that Stephanas came, but also Fortunatus and Achaicus, and these men have made up for your absence. They haven't told me everything that's really good, but they care about you, and that's why they've told me. And they've refreshed my spirit. They've given me some positive things as well. Therefore, I want you to recognize them and listen to what they have to say. Now, a question. And by the way, before the question, let me share how he ends the letter. Look at this final statement. My love be with you all in Christ Jesus. I love you too. And that's why I've addressed your issues. Tough love, yes, but I love you. And that's why I'm addressing these issues. Now the question. Why are some Christians reluctant to be identified by name when they share with their spiritual leaders serious problems that exist in the lives of other Christians? Now, as a pastor, I can identify with the answer to that question because I've had people come to me over the years and say, Gene, I want to tell you about so-and-so. Now, don't tell them I came. Don't use my name. And I've said, wait a minute. You want me to address an issue that I don't know firsthand anything about, and I can't tell you where I got the information? Oh, I'm in an impossible situation. I can't even address the issue. I can't even mention where I got the information. I'm supposed to go out and do research on these people because I've been told they've got a problem. That's how logical that is. Now, I'm exaggerating a bit just to get a point across. That's not the way these guys operated. Their names are here 2,000 years later. We know who they are, and we know, in essence, what they said. Now, we need to think about that. Now, I think there's discretion. We have to be very wise in relationship to some of these issues. But I've even had husbands and wives do that and say, you know, he's got a problem, but don't tell him I told you. And I said, how am I going to address his problem? You need to sit down with me and with him, and we need to address these issues together. Now, there's a very important principle here. But when people are vulnerable, and this is the principle, when people are vulnerable, then I have the responsibility to be loyal to them and to support them and to encourage them and not let somebody else hammer them because they've loved them, and be open enough to share the issues. It comes back on me. It came back on Paul. So Paul defended these men for their vulnerability, their openness. Now, they're all human, didn't resolve all the issues, but the fact of the matter is it's a powerful principle, and we see it illustrated in Paul's life in an incredible, incredible way.